Hello and welcome to another ATP Geopolitics video with myself, Jonathan MS Pierce. This is a Ukraine war update, frontline update for the 19th of March 2023. Where should we go to first? Well, we'll have a little look at what the ISW has to say in their general discussion point here. Worthy of note, a couple of points. First of all, concerning what Russian Foreign Ministry spokesperson Maria Zakharova reiterated on March the 18th. Now, I talked about this, saying that this is a really important point in time where the Russians look like they are, putting out the idea of possibly they could do some negotiations, but at the same time also staking their claims for a maximalist approach to Ukraine. So Zakharova stated that Russia is ready to hear Western Ukrainian proposals for the diplomatic settlement of Russia's full-scale invasion of Ukraine, but noted that the West will need to remove all sanctions and lawsuits from Russia. So I talked about that earlier. If they're going to come to the table, Putin needs to not have any war crime allegations hanging over him, and the sanctions need to be removed. Zakharova continued to reject Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky's conditions of peace talks by noting that removal of Russian forces from occupied Ukrainian territories, reparation obligations, and attendance at international tribunals are unrelated to the establishment of peace in Ukraine. So it's like, we'll only do peace in Ukraine if basically we can still hold parts of Ukraine, and all these things like sanctions and international criminal court arrest warrants are removed. Just highly unlikely, but at least it's a kind of move towards an admission that they're not in a good place. Zakharova instead claimed that peace in Ukraine depends on the West ceasing its weapon deliveries to Ukraine, of course, the international recognition of new territorial realities, of course, and the demilitarization and denazification of Ukraine. Zakharova's demands mirror Russian President Vladimir Putin's maximalist objectives announced on February the 24th, 2022, and are a continuation of the Kremlin's ongoing information operation to prompt the West to offer preemptive concessions to coerce Ukraine into negotiations on conditions of more favorable to Russia. So perhaps they're saying nothing by saying this. It's almost like paying lip service to negotiations. Perhaps it's also this idea that actually we know we're on a hiding to nothing, but we are going to try and get as much out of this as we can. So we'll come to the table if you agree to all of this. And of course, they're not going to agree to all of this. So where will there be some kind of haggling down to a middle point, or are Ukraine going to say no, not at all? We're on the offensive soon, and we ain't going to start negotiations until we've got the offensives out of the way at the very least, and have hopefully they would intend pushing Russia out of many of these territorial occupations that they presently have. Next point of interest that's, I think, very, very worthy of note. BBC and Russian opposition news outlet Mediazona reported on March 17th that Russian forces, excluding the DNR and LNR, so the Donetsk People's Republic and Luhansk People's Republic militiamen, so these are just Russian forces and possibly Wagner as well, have suffered a confirmed. So this is very much like Oryx doing with equipment. These are visually confirmed. In this case, it's confirmed with things like funerals being organized, announcements being made in social media and in newspapers and online. So they've compiled all of this, and they said they know for sure 17,375 people, Russians, have been killed. So at the very, very, very least, there's a confirmed 17,375 dead, not LNR, not DNR. But they reckon a conservative estimate would be at least double that. So they're saying at least 35,000 people have died of Russian forces. And that is your absolute minimum, certainly as an estimation. And that there are 157,000 casualties. The BBC has claimed that the total pro-Russian forces casualties may exceed 211,500 people. BBC noted that 1,304 of the dead it has confirmed perished within the last 2 weeks. So those are absolute confirmed deaths in the last 2 weeks, indicating that the recent casualties are significantly higher than the 2022 average. The majority of Russian soldiers killed in Ukraine reportedly come from outside of Russia's major urban centers. We talked about that the other day. such as Moscow, which comprises 9% of the entire Russian population, has only suffered 107 confirmed deaths. That's insane. While Krasnodar Krai has suffered 714, Sverdlovsk Oblast has suffered 664, and Buryatia 567. So, really interesting set of statistics coming out there, and just shows that Moscow, that you're not going to have a huge amount of people pushing back in Moscow because they won't know that many people who have died in the war. Is that purposeful? Is this some kind of explicit discrimination, or is it, like we talked about the other day, implicit discrimination as a result of there being more military bases in places where there are just poorer, in poorer regions for kind of socioeconomic reasons, rather than outright kind of racial, ethnic discrimination? Anyway, and the next question is, are they all interrelated? Anyway, let's get to the front line. Goodness me, I've been talking for too long as it is. We go to the Kupiansk to Svatova to Kremna front line. So this is in the northeast here. There we go. Kupiansk to Svatova to Kremna. ISW says that the Russian sources claim on March 18th that Russian forces advanced west of Hranikivka. Ukrainian forces withdrew to the west bank of the Oskil River. That's something we've heard already a number of times over the last week. The idea is that the river here, it presents itself as a natural barrier, and that the Russians have pushed the Ukrainians back behind that river. And in fact, arguably, there are no Ukrainians on the east side of the Oskil River around the Hranikivka area, although some other people say that there's still some kind of contention around there. The ISW says it can't verify those claims. Russian sources claimed that Russian forces made marginal territorial gains near Ploshchanka and in the Serebryanska forest. A Russian source also claimed that Russian forces conducted ground attacks near Makivka and Tierny, also Spirna, Kremna, Bilorivka, all the usual places. If we go to null reports, in Kupiansk, it's relatively quiet. There are other reporters who still consider Hranikivka contested. That's what I was just saying. But I can assure you that Ukrainian troops are no longer there. So he says, definitely not contested in Hranikivka. The front is further south at Liman Pershi, and this village changes hands quite often. I find this interesting because, as I've said before, Def Monitor pro-Ukrainian source has Sinkivka under Russian control and has had for weeks. Hasn't changed there. Whereas Null Reports, who probably has more accuracy here, knowing people on the ground, says that Liman Pershi is swapping hands quite regularly. And so there's obviously fighting going on, and that's more likely contested. And Sinkivka is quite probably in Ukrainian hands, as other mappers have as well. If we go to Poulet-Volant here, is slightly more generous for the Ukrainians, calling Hranikivka largely a grey zone. Liman Pershi under Russian hands, but Sinkivka under Ukrainian hands. So that's kind of what is being talked about by null reports. If we come further down south, using Poulet-Volant's map here, we've got Ploshchanka and Chervono-Popivka. Could be arguably slight advances for the Russians around here. Over time, we have seen a bit of realignment of the mapping for Poulet-Volant, pushing the Russians actually back from where they've been more recently. But he appears to show their pressure in the Dubrova area, just north of the forest here. I've done some realignment of my own maps around the Bilorivka areas, so really not a lot to report as we get down to towards Kremna here. The Russians are still pushing very slowly westwards in and around this area, having some small successes maybe in the Ploshchanka and Chervono-Popivka area, but nothing like the offensive we were expecting. Poulet-Volant has Dubrova, pressure around there, and I've changed some mapping around Bilorivka to go in line with Suryak maps. So Suryak maps is a pro-Russian mapper that has around here. This is just south of Bilorivka, a bit of gain for the Russians, just north of Verkhnokamianska, and with the Yanka, with the ending in A, under Russian control there. And the Ukrainians pushing back a little bit to the south. So a bit of pushing and push and pull around there. So some gains for the Russians up here and some gains for the Ukrainians down there. I've realigned my map around here to be slightly more accurate, at least in line with, in this case, Suryak maps for what's going on in Bilorivka, but no no actual movement there. That's a map realignment for myself as opposed to the Russians gaining, just getting, I think, possibly a little more accurate. And then we come down to the northern Bakhmut area. What does NOR reports have to say about Bakhmut? So, to the front in Bakhmut, little has changed compared to this morning. Ukrainian troops pushed Russian troops back a little in the east of the MiG-17 monument. Heavy fighting continues around Kromova. In the north of Bakhmut, it's oddly quiet. So pretty much the same as yesterday. North of Bakhmut, Russian troops tried to get closer to Reupload, but failed. Ukrainian artillery uses the height difference. Russian troops suffer really huge losses there. The images I receive are too violent to share on Twitter. So this is the idea that there's fierce fighting going on around Orikovo, Vasilivka, towards Minkivka as well, but particularly towards Hurivka, from Dubovo, Vasilivka there. So this northern area, some fierce fighting, but no territorial gain as far as no reports is concerned. Rebar has no news at all today, so they didn't produce any reports. And yesterday, let's see if actually no. So I was going to see if Suryat Maps had anything further north. No, it goes down to Avdiivka there. So let's have a look at what they say about Bakhmut. They only have this to say of southern Bakhmut. This is Suryat Maps, as I say, pro-Russian mappers. Situation south of Bakhmut city. The Russian army has made new advances at Samolet and Bunivka district, reaching the outskirts of the stadium area there, where heavy clashes with the Ukrainian army are taking place. So this is here, and they indicate that the Ukrainians are pushing back near that stadium that is down in the south of the city. So if we come back in, this is the only movement of the maps I've done in the immediate Bakhmut. There's a little bit movement towards Ivanivska, to the west of Ivanivska, but here we have some gain of territory around here for the Russians, and they're meeting stiff resistance around the stadium area in the south. Let's go and have a look and see whether ISW say anything particularly different. So this ISW reports the Russians making quite a lot of claims. The Ukrainians are saying usual sort of repelled attacks around all the places, around Bakhmut. So I won't just name them all. Ukrainian general staff specified that Ukrainian forces repelled Russian attacks in the northern part of Bakhmut as well, likely suggesting the Russian forces are concentrating offensive operations in the northern part of the city. Russian mill bloggers have claimed that Wagner Group fighters have captured unspecified industrial facilities in the Azov complex in northern Bakhmut. So that's a metal works, and cleared most of the complex of Ukrainian forces, but ISW has not observed any visual confirmation that Russian forces have advanced into the territory of the Azov complex. So this is, we know they're there at least to a degree. There's geolocated photographic evidence of them in the kind of northern part of that, but for 2 days now, we've had no information as to advances. There are some claims, as ISW says, that Russians mill bloggers are claiming their advances there, but they're unspecified and unverified. So for the time being, I'll leave that. There could be gains for the Russians there, but I will leave it as it is. Russian mill bloggers claim that Wagner fighters continued assaults in the southern and southwestern parts of Bakhmut, and Prigozhin has claimed that Wagner fighters hold positions within 600 to 700 meters of the Bakhmut administrative center. A Russian mill blogger claimed that Wagner fighters secured positions on the west bank of the Bakhmutovka River, Bakhmutka, depends how you say it, near Bakhmut's central market area, although ISW has not observed visual confirmation of these claims. So there were claims the other day that the Russians had gained a foothold on the west of the river, somewhere around here, but they were then forced back over the river, and that could be what ISW are referring to. Sometimes they're like a sort of day behind or so, and accumulating all these claims and trying to verify and whatnot. But what they're referring to is stiff fighting down in the south there. A Russian source claimed that Wagner fighters control 70% of Bakhmut as of March the 18th. ISW assessed that Russian forces occupied roughly 50% of Bakhmut as of March the 8th. So that is, if that's true, then they have taken 20% of Bakhmut in 10 days. And that's obviously significant. ISW has not observed a pace of advance as uh, since then that corresponds with this significantly higher claim about Wagner's control over Bakhmut. So those Russian claims could be over exaggerated or they could be accurate. It's just not verified by ISW here. Russian mill bloggers claim that Wagner fighters also advanced near Kurdyivka, and that's something that I think is referring to yesterday's advance. But I think there are counterattacks, or there have been some Ukrainian counters since then, and that is down here. This area there that I signified yesterday was an advance for the Russians. I am going along with Deep State map to say that there are some advances here. Deep State being fairly accurate of late. So they suggest that the Russians have moved a little closer towards, to the east of Stopochki here in this kind of forested area there, but just it's literally that sort of triangle of land there. So you can see ostensibly very little change considering it was all supposed to be over. Question is, yet again, are the Ukrainians going to hit the Russians in any areas around here with a counterattack? Kenneth Runt, Swedish-Finnish soldier who's been operating in Bakhmut. I don't think he's there at the moment, or if he is, he's not fighting there at the moment. Anyway, he has sources. This is what his summary of what's going on is, and take it with a pinch of salt. The title of this update is "Bakhmut will not be taken." Many people are now saying that I'm sticking my neck out unnecessarily, but all the elements are now in place to claim this. The situation in Bakhmut has not changed for 3 days. It is tough, but the Russians are not advancing to the extent that they could knock us out. Time is on our side, and the Russians' maximum energy has ebbed out, as anyone who follows the more detailed information available can see. So this is in line with what the ISW have stated over the last week, that it looks like, even though the Russians have made incremental gains, that they are slowing down the pace. The number of attacks is fewer. I think it's 83 attacks over the whole front line yesterday. Which is fewer than there has been, and it looks like in Bakhmut as well, the Russian forces are culminating. Since we now have they say they try, but they are so predictable, and ours have the bitter cough medicine ready well in advance. Since we now have urban combat, artillery must be used in a different way than in open ground combat. Now the so-called light artillery plays a big role, and that might well be mortars and such like. We could see this yesterday when the Russians tried to cross a canal like a bunch of headless chickens. They literally became that too. They have to show some success, so therefore they advance a few meters over open ground northwest of Solidar and try attacks on Reupload and Kromova and Spirina without any real results. Why they don't put everything into a single strike in one place, I have been wondering for a long time now. Yet another thing that supports my title: there are armored vehicles pouring into Bakhmut. And it's not Soviet era crap. Even the tanks that were stored near my home have arrived, at least 5 of them. The war bloggers who support the other side are screaming in anger why their strategic bombers are not knocking out our convoys, but we have plenty of air defense in the area. Taking further into account the large forces we have in Siversk and Sloviansk, at least to me, the plans are starting to make sense. There will be one vector for the major offensive. There will not be one vector for the major offensive, but two. The third thing that will decide the war before midsummer is information that has now leaked from the EU and US, Canada. We will receive up to 1 million shells within a short time. This shows that the politicians are now thinking along the lines I described a while ago. Ammunition production cannot cope with a prolonged war. It must be decided in a rapid and merciless attack. So this is kind of like pile all your ammunition and all your efforts into the counteroffensive, and hopefully, from that, you just get a collapse of the Russians. I think is where he's going. Yesterday also came the statement from the General Staff to our battalions that only 2 more weeks are needed until the new elite brigades are fully established. They are ready after that, a few weeks of special training, and these new brigades consist of soldiers with good combat experience. They are taken from different battalions, and in their place, the reserve is filled in. The reserve has also completed its basic training. So we are ready in time for the day T-0. Of course, not everything has gone smoothly due to corruption. Right now, it will only be tolerated to a certain extent, but that the major offensive, it will be hunted down with a blowtorch. Corruption and revelations of the people who profit from the suffering of the population will be a theme in my reporting. More on that later. So he's said before, previously, he's been quite critical of some of the activities of corruption within the Ukrainian system. But of course, that is something that Zelensky is really trying hard to root out. um, make of these cones what you will. Let's go to Poulet-Volant's maps. As we come down to Bakhmut and Chasiv. We have the situation looking pretty much as you expect it. Lots of big red arrows, but those red arrows are not at the moment transferring into large amounts of territorial gain. As I've shown you, just small amounts of gain. Um, there's been quite a bit of activity to the west in Kramatorsk and Konstantinivka, MLRS firing, shelling, all sorts going on. So that is just to let you know. We have Konstantinivka just to the sort of southwest of Bakhmut, and then Kramatorsk up here to the northwest, Sloviansk. So these some of these places are under attack. They have been for a long time, but it seems like I don't know whether there's an uptick in the number of shellings and missiles these places are getting at the moment. But as the Russians are moving incrementally further to the west, these places come under more and more fire as artillery can get closer and closer. Anyway, that's pretty much Bakhmut. You know, I don't know. Either the Russians are culminating or they're not. They are just slowing down for some reason, but they'll pick it up again. I don't know. Either we will see a counterattack around here from the Ukrainians or not. I don't know. It depends who you believe. It may well happen. I will just reflect what is happening in my mapping. Someone accused me yesterday of having really inaccurate mapping. It's like, I'm totally happy with my mapping. I'm when it comes to the mapping, yeah, I might be pro-Ukrainian, but there's no point lying about where troops are on the ground. That will out. That will come out, right? So I will take both sides, both claims from both sides, and adapt my mapping accordingly as I see it as accurately as possible. And if I'm unsure, I won't move my maps. It doesn't mean there hasn't been movement there. There might be movement there. It's just not verified yet. Yeah, so that I think it was pro-Russian yesterday, like had no basis for those accusations. So it is what it is. If you appreciate it, you're here. If you don't, see you later. Okay, let's move from Bakhmut down south towards Avdiivka, where there's been a lot of movement, really, and a lot of talk about Avdiivka over the last sort of week or so. No reports Ukrainian mapper says in Avdiivka, it seems, unfortunately, that Russians have gained a foothold in Krasnohorivka. Absolutely. There are multiple confirmations from private sources fighting is going on. The Ukrainians are offering fierce resistance to the Russians. There are repelled attacks on Nivelska, Pervomaisky, and Severna. And if we go down to Poulet-Volant here, you can see that's the pressure being put on in the Krasnohorivka area towards Stepova, and then towards Kamyanka, and then towards Avdiivka through the southern area, but also towards Severny from Vodyanye and out through Pervomaisky. Now the claims are pretty much that a lot of these have been repelled. There's a bit of movement, as according to Suryak maps, in the Krasnohorivka area. So here we have situation north of Avdiivka. Russian forces made small advances south of Krasnohorivka. There's just a small amount of gained land just to the west of Vesele there. But that's all I have really from them. Really very little from ISW saying unsuccessful attacks, all around those areas, and including Mariinka. And that's all they have to say about Mariinka as well. In the rest of the area, there's actually not a lot of mention of Zaporizhia because that's been quite active over the last few days. Nothing in ISW today, nothing from any of the other sources. A few mentions of Kherson in ISW. So here we have head of the Ukrainian Joint Coordination Press Center of Southern Forces, Homeniuk, reported the Russian forces decreased their rate of artillery fire across the Dnipro River. This is something I talked about yesterday a little bit, which is you've got shell hunger. There isn't that much ammunition hanging around. The claims about culmination. There are claims that a lot of the ammunition has been shipped up to Bakhmut, so on and so forth. This feeds into that as well. You also stated that Russian forces must constantly change positions in the East Bank of Kherson Oblast due to Ukrainian artillery fire. And then there's lots of detail about further building of defenses in the Kherson and Crimean oblasts. A lot of defense, a lot of effort being put in by the Russians in advance, one assumes, of the counter-offensives from the Ukrainians. Anyway, that's today's update. Frontline update. Please like, subscribe, and share. Really appreciate you being here with me. This is the second video I'll do today. Hopefully, I'll have time to do an extra later, but it's Mother's Day and stuff going on Sunday. But look out for that if it comes along. Anyway, Toodle Pit, speak later.